Hello, my name is Catherine, and I am so excited to bring you this video. I've been procrastinating on it for quite a while, but lo and behold, sometimes procrastinating works out because now we have the creators of Jira sponsoring this video. I cannot wait to tell you the story of the 144-point Jira story. So exciting. But first, our sponsor, Atlassian. This is the creator of Jira, Trello, Confluence, tools you use every day in planning and tracking your work as a software engineer. Their collaboration tools are the standard for what's used in tech. I've been using them ever since I started, and they are so essential to making your initiatives move forward. If you work in software engineering, you need to know how to use these tools, period. So today, what I'm going to talk about is what happens when Agile goes wrong. When you're developing, everyone's worried about their piece of the pie, their user story, their ticket, making sure they verify only their change. And sometimes the big picture gets lost. Sometimes you need a user story to just make it work. And that is what we did. Now, I can't talk about the exact use case, but we're going to use an example that's similar. And that's the YouTube algorithm. There was a point where the YouTube algorithm was focused on one thing: views. It was all about how many views do you get, because that's how they recommend things to other viewers. High amount of views, I'm gonna recommend it to more people. But eventually, the creators of the algorithm started adding more and more things to influence what would be recommended. Things like watch time, what the user has watched before, and these components, these additional influences, started as user stories. Some of the stories may have been blocked, some of them could have had dependencies. Then maybe there was a reorg and half the engineers left. At that point, you start to get stuck in this state where the feature or these additional components are half implemented and probably have a bunch of bugs. Maybe there was a lot of different design patterns used in this thing because so many engineers touched it and they wanted to make their mark. Each engineer was focused on their individual component, and once it was merged and verified, on to the next story. The business wanted to roll out this new algorithm, and it's in this half-done, super buggy state that the initiative was handed to me. It barely functioned as expected, and it was overly engineered. There was a lot of coupling, so if you changed one thing, it probably broke a lot of other things. It was also really hard to test, meaning when you changed something, it was hard to tell how it impacted the program. There could be a bunch of side effects that you didn't know about. You need someone that's looking at the big picture and ensures it works as expected. If you're so focused on the individual user stories, who's watching out for this end-to-end functionality? Product? Management? A project manager? That works in theory, but they're not the ones in the code base. The same thing happens with microservices. Everyone's so focused on their individual microservice, who's testing that end-to-end functionality, where the microservice is just a component. But back to the core story. I was looking at this initiative and I was like, before we roll this out, we need to understand what is actually happening in the code. We need to understand the big picture. We need to understand it completely. Now, I could have used the debugger, walked through the code, taken weeks, months to figure all of this out alone. And I did do some of this, but I did not do it alone. In fact, why should I have to do it alone when there are all these other engineers that have worked on the little components and have a somewhat understanding of what's going on? They should be in this too. In fact, it's probably impossible alone, but possible together, especially when using Jira tools. So I partnered with this longtime engineer who worked on it, and they had a pretty good understanding of how it worked at least various times as it was being created. I created a user story for us to re-architect this code and make it understandable, make it easier to contribute to, and make it easier to make it work. And any engineer could probably do this on their own, but the risk is high when you do something like this, because you're essentially saying, let me take this tech debt and do it first in order to get the payoff later. So I collaborated with a senior engineer, and with two minds on this complicated algorithm, likely we would come up with something that would work. So we went back to square one and started talking about what would make this algorithm easier to contribute to, easier to understand. And that started by creating the Jira ticket. So let's create the story. I'm in Jira and I'm gonna click create to create the story. And we'll open this up. And the issue type I'm gonna create is a story. It's gonna be in my project. It's gonna start off with the status to do. And we're gonna call it redesign and implement user recommendation algorithm. Now you could add more details here, but really the goal of this is to make the algorithm easy to understand and easy to contribute to. So I'm gonna say, as a software engineer, and contribute to. And this is a lot of times what happens. You are working on an initiative, and with Agile, the idea is you have these 2-week sprints and then you deliver something at the end with a demo, and everyone does Agile differently. But if you're doing these incremental parts, sometimes you won't have all the requirements up front, or you might find things out along the way that you then have to incorporate, but you already have this code you've written. So ideally, you do such great planning up front that you do not run into this situation. And when we were thinking of pointing this, we decided on the number 144. This is our story point estimate. And to give some context on this, when you point a story, you are essentially assigning its complexity. It's based off of the Fibonacci sequence. So typically you don't want a story over 5 points, and so you might do a 1-point story for like a 1-line change. And then you'll have 3, this is like a medium. Ideally, a lot of your stories are 3-point stories. They require a little bit of thought, a little bit of complexity, but it isn't overwhelming, and it is easy to test, easy to verify. And then you have your 5-point stories, and so Fibonacci, we're going up to 5. And these are large stories. These are meaty, require lots of testing. There's something about it that's a little bit more complex. And sometimes people will estimate their stories based on how much work it is. So figuring out where your team stands on that, like, are you pointing something because it's hard, or are you pointing something because it's gonna take a lot of time to do, or is it a mix of both? Your team has to decide that. We made this 144 because it's very complex. This is a special case. The thing that makes this so complex is that you can't just refactor one component at a time through separate user stories. Everything is so coupled that if you refactor one component, it's likely gonna affect all the other components. So we came up with 144 to decouple and make it so we can actually have individual stories and do Agile in the intended way. Ideally, you would not be in this situation, but sometimes when Agile goes wrong, you have to take a hard turn to get back on the right track. And you can actually add a user story with as many points as you want. I've tried it with some pretty large numbers and it works. So don't be afraid to give yourself a big user story or point something very high. But how do we justify the 144 points? We talked about the big picture. So the points between 144 and 50, so it's about 94-ish, those are just for design. Everyone underestimates how long design takes, but design has to be done well in order for the product to work. This large set of points is for considering every single case that might pop up and what that case means. For example, what does it mean for a video to have a certain level of promotion or a certain score on your platform? Does having a certain attribute disqualify it from this promotion? This is really understanding the requirements and then coming up with a design solution for it. No coding happens at this step. It's all theoretical, and a lot of junior engineers will just skip this step and go straight into coding, everything, and then they'll put up a PR with no tests and they'll say it has no bugs. And then someone will comment on their PR saying, hey, can you redesign this so it's more testable? And then you have to go back to the beginning of the story. And this is where the junior engineer gets really frustrated. But that's because they didn't design anything in the first place. They just started implementing something they thought might work. Ideally, you would design something and then put the design up for a review and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking of implementing. This is the design. I'm not implementing it yet. I'm just designing it. And then if we all agree on the design, then let's move further and let's collaborate before we even start coding. Let's collaborate on the design. Then once the design is approved, we can start coding. So the points between 50 and 21, so like that 30 set of points, those are for building out the foundation. This is implementing the basics of the design. You really want to focus on the design because if you nail the design, the coding part's easy. You're not deciding what you need to code, you're just implementing what's been designed and you're developing the software. This is where the term like software engineer versus software developer, some people don't like the fact that those kind of mean the same thing. Software developer means the design is done for you and you're just implementing the software. Whereas software engineer is more, you're engineering a solution, you're designing the solution and then implementing what you designed. That's why we have separate implementation and design phases. If you skip the design, what you're implementing might not solve the problem. And it's really important to solve the problem and not just make more code. But once all is good, the next part is the rest of the implementation. So those are the points from 27 to 7. You just build out the rest of the implementation. And then from 7 to 0, at this point it's implemented. Then it's the tests. So making sure you're writing tests to verify your design, verify your foundation. And ideally the tests are done throughout the process. And so as you're building out the foundation, you're actually building out the tests. You're building out, this is what we should test, this is what we should test, this is what we should do. And really the tests give you insurance because if you wrote the test first and got the tests reviewed and everyone agrees that these tests very much test what we're trying to add to the code base, then if all the tests pass with your code, then your code must work and your code did what it was supposed to do. So let's click create. And if I want, I could assign it to me or assign it to someone else. And one thing I did want to show within Jira is you can actually go into actions, click configure. And I added this thing called the story point estimates. This was not initially here before, so I could remove that away and then search for story point, add that in, but you can customize what you put in your story. And so I really wanted to add my 144 points, and so I put that in my story. But there are so many other fields you can add here. And then we'll go back to our story. Most of the time, management will not let you do this unless you have a really good reason, because it is risky. You have to convince them it's even more risky not to do this story. And for us, that reason was this was tech debt we could no longer live with. Product was constantly asking for us to put stuff on top of this, and we could not tell them if it worked or not. That's very bad. We were also losing all of the core engineers that had a deep understanding of the edge cases that were broken. So that's what added an additional component of urgency. When you pitch something like this, the 144 point story, management's gonna encourage you to break it up into smaller components, but that coupling was just something we could not decouple unless someone did it with one story. And having a bunch of entry-level engineers try to fix it puts you in another mess. To outsiders, this may have seemed pretty risky, but as long as you have good tests, you can refactor anything. It did end up working out for us, and now it's really easy to understand. There are probably more things we could do to improve it, but figuring out where that line is of how much tech debt do you have to solve to get the improvement you're looking for. There was definitely a line that we had to cut off and say, hey, this is good enough. But we did make it a lot easier to contribute to, which was the core goal. Product did ask us every single week whether it was finished, and there were many weeks where we had to say no until it finally was finished. And then when we rolled it out, we had a bunch of enhancements, week after week after week, and get all these things product wanted out because we had accomplished that tech debt. So that's the story of the 144-point user story. Would I consider doing something like this again? Probably not. It was very stressful. But when you get into this state where you're in extreme tech debt and products constantly asking for stuff, what do you do? Leave a comment down below if you've ever been in this type of situation and how did you handle it? How would you have handled it? Because the 144-point story was a lot, and if there are any suggestions on how to avoid that, let me know. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you Atlassian for sponsoring. Be sure to subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you next time. Happy coding!